Presented by Jon Faine, where you get to ask legal and ethics experts your questions about the pandemic and its impacts. Brought to you by the University of Melbourne Law School, Big Ideas on ABCRN and ABC Radio Melbourne.
And welcome to part 2 of Germs Justice, our Facebook Live event, brought to you from the ABC Radio Melbourne studios, broadcast on Radio National Big Ideas, and sponsored by the Melbourne Law School at the University of Melbourne. Germs Justice is looking at the legal implications and fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic. Today we're looking at industrial relations and jobs with two of Australia's leading experts on the law that provides the structure for the industrial relations and labour market and the system. Professor Miranda Stewart is from the Tax Group at the Melbourne Law School at the University of Melbourne. And Miranda, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And Professor John Howe is co-director of, let me get this right, the Centre for Employment and Labour Relations Law at the Melbourne Law School at the University of Melbourne. John, and thank you very much for lending us your expertise today.
Pleased to be here,
Let's
John.
go through, first of all, with you, John. Job maker, job keeper, job seeker, job everything. These are political marketing slogans. What's the legal foundation for them? What actually are they?
Well, I'd probably start with JobKeeper, I think, because that's a wage subsidy program. And it also is some amendments to the Fair Work Act, which give employers more capacity to negotiate flexibility with unions and their employees to cope with the pandemic. I can come back to more of the detail, but job maker at the moment I think is a slogan, largely a slogan, which is broadly a commitment to job creation as part of the recovery from the pandemic, and will include industrial relations reform to be discussed with unions and employer groups.
And this is an urgent, and in fact, Scott Morrison is making this his big make or break kind of policy.
That's right.
Reform.
Yep.
And we'll get into the detail of that in a moment and what it means and what has to change and what implications, Miranda, it's going to have. But this is an opportunity in this hour of Facebook Live for people to ask questions to us, and you can use the comments section there and get to tailor the discussion specifically to your areas of interest with our two experts here, Miranda and John. So your questions can come straight in as we are on live to air, I was going to say, live to social media on Facebook Live, and we can answer and address those questions as they come through. So don't hesitate, send them in now. So there has to be a legal foundation. We've just seen with robo-debt, for instance, that the government got that wrong. So they were using questionable, in fact, as it would now seem, not just questionable, but actually wrong legal foundations for clawing back $700 million worth of debt that they claimed people owed, which they didn't. So when governments get these things wrong, we can see it has massive impact.
Absolutely.
Let's go then. Job seeker it's actually just that's a tag that's been put on a complex set of rules. How do they work?
Well, I think Miranda's probably the greater expert on job seeker.
So, Miranda.
So job seeker is an amendment to the Social Security law, not so much the labour relations law. It basically is what we used to call New Start, unemployment benefit, which of course we've always had in the system.
The dole.
The dole, although it had many constraints and was really very low, and as many have argued over the years, inadequate. So the job seeker has involved an increase in that, what was called the coronavirus supplement, very substantial increase.
Is that done by a regulation? Because Parliament hasn't done anything about these things.
So Parliament has done a couple of things. They did come back and legislate, I think, in order to implement aspects of JobKeeper and to give the Minister for Social Security some power to modify conditions and income testing and so on, and also to deliver JobSeeker. But most of it's been done with that delegated, executive action once
by
they
regulations
had that power.
Rather than legislation.
Or even ministerial direction, actually, in the social security area. So JobSeeker, a couple of things. They increase the payment dramatically, so we have a much more substantial payment for those who can't find a job or who have lost their jobs after COVID, including people who were already on New Start. And then we also have a complete relaxation of conditions, what we used to call mutual obligation, conditions to look for work and so on.
So if you're on the dole, I keep calling it that, you are able to continue to receive a benefit as long as you do these things.
That was the previous requirement, was you had these obligations to go to a certain number of job interviews, to turn up at your job supply centre and so on, and various other conditions as well. So those have been relaxed. And the third thing that's been relaxed is the income testing on Job Seeker has been made a bit more generous, both for individuals and for couples. There's still an income test, but the asset test and income test have both been relaxed somewhat.
And then we're going to see over the reboot of the economy now that those various thresholds or hurdles are going to be slowly brought back in.
Well, that's an interesting question as to whether that will happen and when it will happen. My impression is the government is keen to reintroduce all those framing conditions for Job Seeker. In fact, we had an announcement just recently that mutual obligation will be gradually brought back in pretty soon, in the month of June.
Even though there are still huge numbers of people who have never been within the pool of unemployed before, but have found themselves there for no fault of their own, nothing to do with their own conduct, their own behaviour, their own situation, but entirely because of the circumstances of the pandemic.
Well, what mutual obligation means is that there's an expectation that the worker will take some steps. That is, the unemployed person will seek jobs or will start to apply for jobs. It's sort of what we would call a supply side measure, like the labour supply. And in an era where we have such high unemployment still because of that is not enough jobs, we really need to be stimulating the job side, which, as John mentioned, we're looking at sort of stimulating or creating jobs for people.
So going back to where we were then, John, the industrial relations reforms are said to be a very big part of getting the economy working again. The Prime Minister is staking his reputation, his political future in some ways, but this is not political commentary, this is legal analysis and commentary here. What are the industrial relations reforms? We hear about things like award simplification and the like. Can we go through those things, explain how they work, why they may or may not be able to be tinkered with, and then we'll put all of this together. But if you've got questions as well, do straight away send them in now. Don't wait till we get towards the end, but send them in now and we'll work your questions in as well on our Facebook Live session on Germs Justice today, looking at industrial relations. John.
Thanks, John. Well, I think the staggering thing really about the government's job maker slogan and what they've committed to is the consultation part of it with employers and trade unions. This government's had a very antagonistic relationship with unions, but by offering to consult over these reforms, and withdrawing a bill that they had before Parliament that was going to place further restrictions on unions, the Ensuring Integrity Bill, the government's kind of made this commitment but also put something on the table or taken something off the table to show their commitment to it. Some people have been calling it Accord Mark II, but I don't think it's that. It's just a commitment to consult.
Is it a step towards Accord Mark II? Might it end up being Accord Mark II?
I guess anything's possible, but I just see it as a commitment to consult. What the government said is that it wants to make a decision on reforms by September. So it's quite possible that the consultation leads to no agreement with unions or employer groups on what changes are to be made, and the government just goes ahead and makes them. So it's a bit hard to say at this stage whether it will lead to any sort of ongoing pact between unions, employer groups and the government.
We've got some questions, and John, I'll ask yours in just a moment, but if people want another John. There's already one in the guest side, one on the host side, and now one on the question side. Sorry if that leaves you feeling a bit lonely there, Miranda, but we'll get to John's question and others in a moment. Do send them in and we'll work them into our conversation on Germs Justice, looking at industrial relations and the job market today on Facebook Live, on Big Ideas on Radio National. If you start tinkering, though, with the industrial relations system, as John's just explained, Miranda, doesn't that then have an impact? It's got like a knock-on effect, not just to welfare, obviously, but to tax, to all the economic benefits that come in this complex interlocking mechanism of what's called, I think, the transfer system, the way people connect to government services.
I think you make a good point, which is the way that all these different areas of legal regulation, labour market regulation and what you may think of as labour law, tax law, the tax system, social security law, our transfer or social security system, and even things like childcare policy, so we could come back to that, and the law that delivers that. So all of these intersect on what you might think of as you and me, bodies who are kind of going to work, earning wages or want to go to work, and also need to maintain income for our households and keep consuming and paying mortgages and so on. So if there are labour law changes, one of the interesting aspects is the flexibility of the labour force, and perhaps that's worth coming back to. I'm not a labour law expert, but I think we already have quite a flexible labour force. And that has led to the issues, for example, the lack of we've noticed that many workers don't have paid sick leave, for example. And that's an issue as we sort of work our way out of COVID-19, and we want to actually be able to pay workers to stay home as well as pay workers to come to work when we need them to. So the design of all these things is important, and perhaps we can come back to how you might think about designing a social security payment that would work well with the labour force that we're going to see as we come out of COVID-19.
People are starting to talk about universal basic incomes, all of which were regarded as pie in the sky under a Labor government, let alone under a Conservative government. We'll come back to that as well. John has asked by Facebook Live, as a sole trader, can I get help filling out the spreadsheets for JobKeeper money? I've tried ringing the ATO all weekend. The system's down. No help. My tax agent is lost, and John is not alone. And when the government had to admit the other day that a vastly lower number of people are taking it up than was originally anticipated, I suspect, even though they've tried to make it fairly user-friendly, a lot of people find it overwhelmingly complex. Do you think that's part of what's going on, John?
Yeah, quite possibly. And I think also it's striking what John says about difficulty getting advice. And I think the Fair Work Ombudsman is quite well set up to give people advice about, employment standards and so on. But the ATO, not so much. So one of the issues with JobKeeper is it straddles different agencies.
And putting the ATO as the gatekeeper, was that a good idea or a bad idea, Miranda? At first blush, I always thought it was a great idea because it would stop people feeling, oh, good, I can rort this, because no one wants to lock horns with the tax office.
Well, it's probably it has pros and cons, and you've identified that. On one view, perhaps, it had to be the ATO because it's our biggest system that carries the information, the data required about workers and employers that we have in the country. It's a federal system and it's got consolidated data in what we call the single touch payroll system, which directly links real-time data from the employer about their payroll, the wages they pay, to the ATO. And every business, even sole traders, have got an ABN and have a tax file number, and the data is in the system. So it's you raised a robo-debt at the beginning of this session. It's an interesting question how government can use data and systems actually to deliver payments like this. To be honest, although it has been very difficult for people like John, I think sole traders, self-employed, it's been hardest for them. They have to establish their entitlement, their turnover, hard to get advice and that sort of thing. I understand that. There's long queues on the phones. To be honest, on the other hand, we've made these payments faster than I have ever seen government do mass payments to people.
So that's the offset, isn't it?
It's been extraordinary. I mean, the GFC 10 years ago, the government made a much smaller fiscal stimulus payment to nearly every household. It took 3 months for that payment to go out. One payment.
So if the idea here was, okay, we're going to do something, it'll be imperfect, it's going to be rough and ready, there'll be a few bits around the edges where we'll go, oh, that wasn't supposed to happen and that wasn't supposed to happen, but overall
Yeah, there are quite a few bits where it hasn't worked ideally, so one would want to move on from this. But as a first move, it's pretty impressive.
There was bound to be issues given how rapidly it was rolled out. But
I feel for people like John who made that comment. I don't want to sound as if his concerns are not important.
No, and apparently the accountants are feeling the pressure as well. They've never had to work so hard in their lives. More questions coming through. I'll get to Cheryl and Elisa's questions in just a second, but we need to do a few other bits of setting the foundations before we can go further. The industrial relations reforms that are being talked about, John, we've heard a lot just in the first blush of the announcement that there are too many awards and they're far too complex. And there are a lot of employment agreements that then contradict or make even more complicated the arrangements between a boss and a worker. First of all, do you agree? And secondly, how do you go then undoing what's been there for a long time?
Look, I don't buy the argument that there's a lot of complexity in awards and there's too many. I mean, but 10 years ago, and just over 10 years ago, we had thousands of awards across Australia, and now we've got about 122. So the award modernisation process under the Fair Work Act's really brought down the number of instruments which apply to most workers. And they're much simpler documents than they were before that process as well.
Okay, so the fact that it used to be even worse doesn't mean you can't improve what we've got now, though.
Well, it depends what's being talked about as complexity. So I know one of the things that many employers are unhappy about is the different wage classifications. So you have within awards different wage levels based on what the worker does and how skilled that role is and so on. And we have things like penalty rates and overtime and so on. Now, they're often described as complexity, but obviously they're in there as protections for workers. And the argument was made in relation to penalty rates, that was inhibiting job growth. And so penalty rates have already been modified in many and reduced in many awards, particularly in retail and hospitality. An analysis to date suggests there's been no job creation results that can be proved by evidence as a result of those reductions in penalty rates. So there's a real question about, even if that can be called complexity, will reducing it actually lead to the job making that the government claims?
Well, there's not much point imposing conditions on people wanting to get support if they have to apply for jobs that don't exist, number one. Number two, the casualisation. We haven't touched on this, but it's a ever-growing part of the job market now. More and more employers find that it's economically to their advantage as well as management-wise to their advantage to avoid putting people on as full-time staffers for whom they have ongoing obligations. And so we've got this casualisation of the workforce. That's not about to suddenly change, though, is it, Miranda? I would have thought that's there now to stay.
Well, I wouldn't say I'm a labour law expert, but I can't imagine that changing, to be honest. I think it's as much as 25% of the labour force, and it's really, we knew it was a lot, but I guess COVID-19 has really revealed that, because so many sectors that are highly casualised, universities are one sector where JobKeeper has not benefited people in the university sector, but hospitality and retail have been really directly affected.
Tourism,
exactly.
Huge.
So perhaps what that shows is that when you have a really high risk event, there's like COVID-19, an totally unexpected event like that has such a big impact, we need broader governmental systems that can step in to support, rather than relying always on the employer relationship or the structure of that employment.
We'll come to fake casuals in a moment, because there was a very important decision of the courts the other day saying that you can actually be described by your boss as a casual and get paid more as a casual, but still accrue annual leave, sick leave and all those other things. And we'll come to that decision in a moment, because it's absolutely fascinating. But we've got several questions here. Essie says, JobKeeper is so complex. I've got a law degree, but the accounting and various tests for sole traders, it's overwhelming. Still called the ATO to confirm my understanding of their regulations. They couldn't even tell me 3 hours later, ... So there's an example. There's several reports from people, even just in our little chat today, people saying, no wonder so many people dropped out after initially registering. They just dropped out and said, nah, too hard. So, Essie, in best Tony Jones fashion, I'll take that as a comment. Elise says, is there any legal argument that can be made to keep the JobMaker payment at its current amount? Now it's been acknowledged that New Start was so inadequate for people to live with dignity.
So that probably referring to job seeker, given that JobMaker we think is at this stage a promise or a proposal, not a payment.
We're not sure what it is legally.
So I think the big issue here is what does happen with the design of job seeker going forward. That is one big policy issue. And it's interesting the government keeps saying that they're going to be doing these things in June or by September. So we have a budget in October. Normally we would have the budget in May. The budget was deferred. And the timing of all these activities is sort of pre-budget. It's as if they want to resolve some of these things before the budget. It's hard to see all of that being done. So should job seeker, I think it's widely accepted that the old job seeker, New Start, was too low. $40 a day, people could not live on that. And the very fact that the government leapt in with the coronavirus supplement, the new job seeker, which was so much higher, suggests that they understand that actually you couldn't ask unstigmatised or, your normal person who turns out not to have a job, they couldn't live on that. So we really, I think, need to increase that basic payment. Job seeker is too high and the income testing is weird on job seeker as well. So we want to revise it, but how should we do that is not quite clear.
It's interesting because a lot of those rules are designed to act as barriers to stop people accessing things that the government thinks they don't need or shouldn't get as a way of controlling revenue. Yes. At the moment, government's throwing money at things like nothing else, so you'd think they'd say, well, at the moment, the whole point of the system has changed, and instead we're trying to get people onto it rather than stop people getting onto it.
So you've got to stop people being in poverty, but you also want to get them to start consuming again, I suppose, and that'll help with the job creation side of things if demand is kept up.
Yep. This is Germs Justice, a Facebook Live event brought to you from the studios of ABC Radio Melbourne, broadcast on Big Ideas on Radio National and sponsored by the Melbourne Law School at the University of Melbourne. And with me are Professor Miranda Stewart from the Tax Group at the Melbourne Law School and Professor John Howe, Co-Director of the Centre for Employment and Labour Relations Law. If you've got questions, you can send them to us now on Facebook Live, whether it's about casualisation, the gig economy, underpayment, which has been a huge issue, in particular with rip-offs in hospitality, tourism and across all sorts of other sectors. And suddenly that's going to come in for focus again. But also this whole push for some form of new industrial relations agenda. If you've got questions, the two experts who can answer them are here with me now, and you can send them to us straight away and we'll see if we can get you some answers. Let's look at casualisation. John, the federal court last week was asked to resolve a dispute for one person employed by a labour hire company. It's called the Rosato case. Describe to us what was at stake here and why it matters.
Okay, well, thanks, John. The Rosato case was really about what is a casual employee. So the casual is a legal status in Australia, and it means if you're a casual employee that you don't get all of the benefits an ongoing employee would get or a full status employee would get, but instead you get a loading, an additional payment in lieu of things like annual leave and sick leave. And the test for when is someone a casual is there's not been a clear test. So this was a test case about what is the legal status of casual. And
you're a casual if the boss says you're a casual?
The two arguments were, do you look at the circumstances and say, is this person really a casual in a sense of someone who doesn't have fixed hours and can be brought in at different times and doesn't have a regular program of work, or is it just based on what your employer calls you?
So in the Rosato case, my very simplistic explanation of it, and please feel absolutely free to correct me, but the bosses said you're all casual, but here's your roster for the next 12 months,
yep,
which contradicted any normal definition of what it is or isn't to be.
And if my memory is correct, it's in the mining. They were working in the mining industry, so they were sort of fly-in, fly-out workers. So they had a fairly rigid program of when they were rostered on and would go in and when they would have their time off.
So we've got what are called fake casuals. They're not really casual, they're just branded as
Well, that's
casual.
what the court found, that even though they were called casuals, they were not in actual fact casuals.
And yet it's very hard to reconcile that you get a loading for being a casual, but then you get the things like sick leave or holidays that the loading is there to compensate you for missing out on. And if you're not missing out on them, how can you get the loading as well?
Well, I think the court wanted to focus on the question of whether or not they were a casual, and if they weren't a casual, then they're entitled to the leave and the other entitlements of
So
a
stop pretending
regular employee. And they didn't want to deal with they didn't accept the offset argument that in that case we've already paid them this loading, so can't we just offset that against what they're entitled to?
But what it does is it illustrates to us how complex this is, and once you start playing around with it, you open up all sorts of issues.
Yes, that's true. And I think the other issue is this was the mining industry. So, as you've said, there was a very fixed schedule of work and so on, whereas, you might have people in retail, hospitality, who have very different working arrangements and they're being called casual. So, this was a very stark case of fake casuals, if you like, but it's a much greyer area in other industries to determine whether someone's really a casual or not.
And this throws up for us, of course, Miranda, just how differently the impact of these sorts of things, how they impact differently on different groups in the community. So women, young workers, the whole gig economy, casualisation, wage theft argument, that impacts some people and it's completely others are completely oblivious to it. They wouldn't even know about it because it just doesn't, it's not part of their working life at all. So that brings up questions of fairness and equity.
Yes, well, I guess if you're in a full-time job or a full-time permanent job, it's sometimes hard to even think exactly what that is, but a lot of Australians do have full-time jobs, even though many have been stood down at the moment because of COVID-19.
Particularly in the public sector, it must be said.
I think also in the private sector, I think the majority of workers, even in the private businesses, are on these full-time jobs. But there are particular sectors where that's perhaps less the case. But perhaps the point that you're making is that you can sort of see the way that those labour definitions and conditions affect different sectors of the labour market differently. So some parts of the labour market are much more flexible, you might say, than others. You raise the possibility of women being treated differently. So what we see, I think, perhaps more often is casualisation, but also part-time workers. We see a strong concentration of women in the part-time sector, not getting as... And also many women increasing numbers saying they're underemployed, so actually wanting more hours, like I think many casuals do, but not able to get those hours.
Because the definition of being unemployed, do we need to remind people how absurd it is? Because we talk about the unemployment rate, but in fact when you bury down into what the actual definitions are, it's a very different picture.
I don't know if you can say what the ABS definition of unemployed is. Actively, so looking for work. So in the labour, you have to be in the labour force. So actually looking for work. There's a segment of the population which is not even looking for work.
Yes, but if you have any work during the week, even if you want full-time work, but you're only doing half a day.
Yeah, so it doesn't measure underemployment, where you've got a little bit of work, you really want a lot more. But that you're not counted as unemployed.
Yeah, so you can have a half a day a week and you don't count as unemployed even though you're wanting a full-time job and you can't find it.
That's right. And also you might have highly fluctuating job hours and also income. So, it might be seasonal or it might depend on, retail hours or on hospitality hours or shift work on businesses needing extra shifts. And that fluctuation of income also is a real issue in terms of how the labour market intersects with the social security system, because that system looks at how much income people have once a fortnight in their family and is intended to assist with that.
We're on Germs Justice episode 2 today on Facebook Live. If you've got questions for our guests, Professors Miranda Stewart and John Howe, do send them in on Facebook now and we'll have time to answer them on today's episode. You can be listening to us on Big Ideas on Radio National. hearing us now on Facebook Live and send in your questions, and we'll deal with them as best as our experts can. We touched on the gig economy before. There's an aspect of all of this, of course, that people are loath to talk about, John. Unions represent an ever-diminishing proportion of the workforce. And yet the government is concentrating its reform negotiations on talking to the big unions and their umbrella body, the ACTU. How realistic is it that you can resolve all the problems of the labour force when you're negotiating with an organisation or organisations that represent an ever-diminishing fragment of it?
Yeah, that's a really good question, John. And we're seeing a lot more groups now representing workers that aren't part of unions but are also very, very vulnerable. So, there's migrant worker centres. Well, there's a community legal centres specifically set up to help migrant workers, for example. And then you've got the Young Workers Centre. So some of these different organisations. So there's a question of whether they're also going to be brought into the consultation because, of course, the government's talked about bringing in a wider group of stakeholders, but we don't yet know what that wider group, is or consists of beyond the ACTU.
There's an argument that the unions represent the people who need help the least. The people who need the help the most aren't members of unions. The gig economy, the migrant workers, people that you've just explained and listed there, they're not covered by unions. And so in some workforces, you've actually got the people who are best off represented by the unions, the people who need help the most, the casuals and so on, aren't in the union.
I wouldn't necessarily agree with that. I think you'd have you'd have United Voice arguing pretty strongly against that. Some of the unions that do represent some of the, more highly casualised workers.
But there's a structural flaw. Casuals aren't members of unions, so unions don't advocate for them.
Casual workers can be members of unions.
They can be, but most of them aren't, because it's expensive for a start and there's no compulsory or required sign up the way there is, say, on a building site or whatever it might be.
Oh, look, that's true, but I think you do have some unions that are operating in sectors where if they weren't trying to organise casual workers and and help improve employment standards in those industries, well, they wouldn't have a lot to do because of the nature of those industries. But you're right. Look, they don't necessarily have members among a lot of those groups.
It's a subtle and...
It is. I was going to say it's getting into...
Well, it's always concerned me, so I thought I'd throw it in there along the way. Now, Cheryl says if you're currently on Job Seeker but have health issues which, for instance, make you immune compromised, you'll still be required to apply for any job, including jobs which could put you at risk of exposure to COVID-19. So how is the job test or these reintroduced conditions, Miranda, that you were talking about, how's it going to take people's personal circumstances into account is Cheryl's excellent question.
Yeah, look, I think that's one of the challenges with moving quickly to reintroduce mutual obligation. As I say, those conditions were removed by more or less by direction or suspended for the coronavirus supplement. But as we move out, it has been said that they will be gradually introduced. It's not entirely clear what gradually means, whether that means you'll apply for fewer jobs or you just have to register again with a job centre or, what level of engagement's going to be required. I think that you will be able to say, for example, if you are sick or you have certain conditions, that you should be excluded from
what if
the
you're
obligation.
Just anxious? The government's been, I think they deserve great credit for having put mental health and anxiety right up the list of things they were addressing. And there's enormous, almost I'd say unprecedented levels of anxiety across not just the working but the entire community. So what happens if you just say, look, no, I don't feel ready to go out or I don't want to go into a workplace. I don't think I'll cope with that.
So I think government COVID-19 does pose a really big challenge for government policy because they have to really reassure, not only to help to recreate these jobs and reopen, but actually reassure the population. And associated with that, it will affect the economic recovery if people are nervous about re-entering the labour market. And so they won't do that. They may still be receiving income support or relying on savings, but they're not going to want to spend that money because they'll be anxious about the future. And so they won't be expanding consumption. So really, this is why I say that reintroducing conditions like that really quickly is sort of attempting to kind of, again, put those rationing rules back on those payments, whereas really what we need to be doing is encouraging stimulus in a positive way, getting people into jobs, reopening workplaces, rather than punishing people who don't engage immediately.
I'll get to Jacqueline and Adam's questions in a moment. Do send in more. We've got plenty of time for some more with Professors Miranda Stewart and John Howe from the Melbourne Law School, talking about industrial relations and the reforms that are going to be part of the recovery for Germs Justice episode 2 today. Take me through what's called the BOOT test, if you could please, John, the Better Off Overall test, which is part of the reform of the awards system. You've got to make sure, at the moment under the law, you've got to make sure no one's going backwards. So explain how that actually works and how you reform it.
Okay, so the Better Off Overall test is applied to enterprise agreements between employers and their representatives, usually trade unions, and sometimes directly with employees, to make sure that by entering into the enterprise agreement, you are better off overall than you would be under the relevant award.
So every single person in a workplace...
That's how it's been interpreted by the Fair Work Commission.
So you can say we've got almost everybody's better off, but there is this person who comes in twice a week in the middle of the night to do the cleaning.
Yes.
They're not better off, so nobody gets any of the benefit.
Yep. That's how it's been applied in the last 3 years or so by the Fair Work Commission.
Which is the industrial umpire.
That's the industrial umpire. So there are arguments that, that it should be just the majority of employees being better off overall, but the Commission's taken the approach that it has to be all employees.
And then the alternative is to go back to what we used to have, which is called the no disadvantage test. So how does that work?
Well, that was applied on the basis no worker was disadvantaged by being on the enterprise agreement. So there's an argument that was a sort of a lower benchmark because you didn't have to be better off.
Someone may not be better off, but they're not worse off.
But they're not worse off. That's right. And that's what some of the employer groups would like to go back to.
And is there likely to be some progress on that front?
I can't see. Look, there might be some unions that would agree to a better off overall test that applied to a majority rather than the whole workforce. Certainly the SDA that represents some of the retail workers would argue that. But I can't see agreement around going back to the no disadvantage test between employers and unions. And I think we're going to see it is going to be difficult to meet for unions and employers to meet on a lot of the areas where there's disagreement. And that's particularly the case, I think, in relation to enterprise bargaining and enterprise agreements.
Well, these are important and fragile arrangements that have evolved sometimes after all sorts of industrial disputes, even litigation, and we arrive at a position, and this is almost taking us full circle, isn't it, Miranda? If you start playing with it, there's a kind of knock-on effect. If you change this, well, that impacts on that, and on it goes. Before we know it.
That's right. And it sort of reveals the boundaries between different kinds of workers too. Like in some sectors that you might get agreement on something like this, and in some workplaces you might, and others you'll have a stricter line. The other boundary that some of your questions have raised has been coming back to the gig economy between the self-employed, what you might think of as small business owners really, whether their own, and people who are employees. Whether casual or permanent, full-time or whatever employees. And that's another really difficult boundary in labour law, but also in designing something like JobKeeper, the self-employed have really had the most difficulty getting support, especially, I think, in the arts sector as well as other areas.
Which is what Jackie's written in about. You've forgotten about the arts.
Haven't forgotten about the arts. No, I feel really... So the way that JobKeeper was designed was that it was intended to cover the self-employed. It did have that design, and it didn't have to be done that way, actually. So, that was good that they had done that. But nonetheless, the way they defined turnover, the way that they've defined the period of time that you're carrying on work, it was still very difficult for many arts workers to qualify because of the way they operate on project-based contracts, I think, basically. So that's one of the areas where JobKeeper has failed to support.
And I'll come back to my earlier point, John, the arts would be one of the least unionised parts of the economy. So back to my point about how the unions go into fight for their members, it's not an area where they've been active, it's not an area where they've made great inroads, and it's an area where people have been incredibly vulnerable.
Well, look, there is a union in that sector, but yes, you're right in saying it's not a highly unionised sector.
Yeah. And, again, we've got the whole casualisation, wage theft, gig economy sort of stuff happening in the arts as much as anywhere else. And a lot of people, it's a transition industry. A lot of people are in there only for a while and then they go, well, I can't make a living out of this. I'm going to have to go and get a real job.
Well, I wonder how many arts people would agree with you there, John. I'm not sure. But, one of the things...
Well, for everyone who wants to be a musician, there's about 10% who make it, isn't it?
Yeah. Well,
hopefully my son, who's studying TV and media, does not listening to this. Sorry.
Yeah, that's right. I've got a son who's a drummer, so we could...
You have my profound sympathy on that front. We'll get to more questions in a moment as well, but still moving on through some of the other issues that are absolutely crucial here. The awards are being replaced by contracts of employment in so many different workplaces. So might there be a way of saying, well, awards are useful for guidance here, but what we want to do is create a different job market where people are covered by contracts of employment rather than some arbitrary award negotiated that they may have had nothing to do with?
Well, just on terminology, all employees have a contract of employment, and then the award sits over that and mandates sort of minimum terms and conditions of employment for most workers within that industry.
And you're not allowed to contract against the award. And
you can't contract out of the award. But then you have the enterprise agreements, which are like collective contracts, which can vary the award, but are subject to that better off overall test. I don't think anyone's suggesting a return to, conditions largely driven by contract, because that's the system New Zealand had back in the 90s, and it really led to driving down working conditions extensively. So I don't think that's really on the table, but I think what employer groups do want is they want, simplification of awards, which largely they mean fewer terms and conditions that employers have to navigate and comply with.
And they say that part of the reason why we've had this wage theft crisis in restaurants and cafes and hospitality is because of the complexity of what we were supposed to somehow be able to keep track of.
That's
Famously, right. George Columbaris, the chef who got busted, said, well, it's just too hard.
And I think a lot of that sort of underpayment was coming about through annualised salaries. So employers were putting people on an annual salary payment, middle managers in the Columbaris empire and so on, and we've seen it in other big employers too. But under the award, if you put someone on an annualised salary, that still has to comply with the minimum terms and conditions of employment. And once you took into account the working hours of these people, they're being underpaid. Now, on one view, the award system's actually a lot less complex than, say, the tax system or some of the other regulatory requirements employers have to observe. So make your calculations and get it right, particularly when you're talking about large businesses like, the Columbaris Maid Establishment Group. The Rockpool Empire's also been implicated in this. Woolworths.
Yep.
They've got the resources to get it right. But, I think I suppose for the smaller employers, sole traders and so on, the complexity argument is a much stronger one for them.
Dare I say it, the ABC was amongst those who realised that they'd wrongly calculated the entitlements of some of its staff.
Yeah. I mean, and what this doesn't deal with is cash wages. So just about a year ago, the government had a Black Economy Task Force which reported on the extent of just cash wages and other forms of kind of cash that is unregulated payment in other areas. My impression is there are quite a lot of both large and small employers where there's cash payments which are under award payments being made and potentially avoiding workers' comp, tax and even social security type means testing.
Superannuation payments.
Superannuation guarantee. There's a superannuation guarantee amnesty at the moment for employers. In fact, it was they were trying to get it extended because of COVID-19, but it's not clear if that's going to happen. There has been, it's a small fraction of the total employment work payment system, but there has been quite a bit of underpayment of the super guarantee as well.
And dare I suggest it, when John Howe and Peter Costello brought the GST in, we were told that would be the end of the black economy. And of course, it's something we're still waiting to see. Still time for your questions to be answered by our guests, Professor Miranda Stewart and John Howe from the Melbourne Law School at the University of Melbourne. They're experts in the area of industrial law, tax and transfer law, how the system works and all the tweaks the government's proposing as part of the response to the pandemic. Well, we can answer your questions if you're quick and get them through to us on Facebook Live before we run out of time today. Adam has said if staff were required to take a large pay cut in order to keep their full-time jobs, at what point would an employer be expected to reinstate the original pay and return wages to normal levels?
Okay, well, look, that's something that has to be agreed with your employer or between the employer and union in the case of awards, or between the employer and whoever is the employee representative or representatives under an enterprise agreement.
So it can't be done just unilaterally. In other words, on their own. They can't just say, take it or leave it, I'm going to pay you this much for the business to survive, and somewhere down the track we might look at going back to where we used to be. You're not allowed to do that?
Well, certainly not if it's a reduction that undercuts what's required by an award or an enterprise agreement. If your pay would be cut to something above those levels, it's still a variation of your contract of employment.
So Adam goes on to say, are they in their rights to even do this in the first place, to which you've said no, but then it brings
not if it undercuts the award, and not if it's unilateral in the case of an above award or above enterprise agreement.
But my understanding is that Fair Work have been overwhelmed with people, as has the Fair Work Ombudsman, people saying, hang on, I think I'm being ripped off here, and they don't have the resources to follow up.
Yes, look, I think that's
a fraction of the cases they're having reported to them.
Yep, I think that's a real issue, that in these sort of circumstances, that there are no doubt, many businesses, whether deliberately or otherwise, trying to make changes that are not necessarily compliant.
Which leads Adam to the conclusion some businesses are using this episode as a good excuse to reduce staff and overheads with no recourse for employees at all.
Well, I'm not sure about there's no recourse for employees, but from what I've seen, there's no doubt many employers are using the fact of COVID-19 and the crisis to make significant changes to their workplaces. Sometimes that's in consultation with unions and employee representatives and through the Commission, Fair Work Commission. In other cases, it's not being done through those processes. And there's a question for me, in many cases, that's no doubt caused by the impact of the crisis and an effort to manage and keep the business going. But I think you are seeing some employers, why waste a good crisis when you might have wanted to make some changes that would have been controversial and resisted strongly in normal times. In a crisis, it might be a time to make those changes, and you're less likely to have resistance to the changes you want to make.
Which takes us to one of the fundamentals that we've kind of hinted at but not specifically addressed, so let's do so, which is that employment and industrial relations are about power. Fundamentally, it's about power, and in the current market, if people are losing jobs, they have suddenly no power in their negotiations with the people who are offering jobs.
Look, essentially the main source of power of an employee is their ability to find another job, to be able to say they're not happy with their lot at one place and to be able to go somewhere else. And often, that's more skilled employees whose skills are in demand have greater bargaining power in that.
And good bosses, good employers.
That's right.
They will always do the right thing. But we're not talking about them because they're not the ones under scrutiny.
No.
And it sort of depends on whether your employers, some of them might be planning for the longer term. We've seen just in terms of our law students, the law firms and accounting firms that hire those students and how they manage their graduate intakes. Sometimes they're cutting them, sometimes they're trying to cut conditions or whatever, and sometimes they're maintaining them for the longer term. But again, that brings me back to this issue of mutual obligation. It does seem, so one way that the COVID-19 policy, the job seeker policy and job keeper has actually protected to some extent workers, right? Because it's given them something to fall back on, an income payment for now. And so as we transition out of that, it does concern me to hear the government saying that people aren't seeking work or wanting to force people off payments when it's not clear that the jobs are yet available. I'd like to see that much more carefully managed as we transition out.
And that brings us to the idea of universal basic income, and I do want to get to that, but we've got lots of questions and I need to address them. Jacqueline said universities are taking a hit, and of course uni staff are not eligible for the job keeper package. You're both somewhat conflicted here, of course, because you both work for one of our most respected and eminent universities, and you wouldn't ever, of course, criticise the administration of the University of Melbourne, would you? There's nothing they can do. They're caught between a rock and a hard place.
Also a member of the union, have to say. Happy to say that. But the universities, I think what one can say is that it definitely, even a university that has substantial income and reserves, like the University of Melbourne, has lost a large amount of current income and is trying to find ways to manage that. There are concerns in the university sector because JobKeeper doesn't apply, except apparently to some private universities. That does mean that casual workers and those who are only on a few hours, they are really vulnerable, and
people
many of them are losing.
Being dropped left, right, and centre.
Many of them are losing jobs.
Yeah, it's terrifying. In fact, the universities are bending over backwards, but their pleas to the government have fallen on deaf ears. Louise says, "I'm a casual in retail. I haven't had a shift for 3 months, but I did fill a shift on the weekend. I've been working for this employer for less than 12 months, so I don't qualify for the government scheme's job keeper, job seeker, and that puts pressure financially on our family unit." And that's precisely the coalface. That's the issue here, isn't it?
So job keeper, yes, there's those conditions, the 12-month employment, the employer has to be eligible as well, and so on.
That's the $1,500 a fortnight job
the
keeper
wage
to keep your employees on.
Yeah, so job seeker,
you fall back onto that, don't you?
Someone like this should be eligible for job seeker, but because the way we means test the job seeker, although they've relaxed the income tests compared to the old New Start, we still have income testing, and when you have it's tested on the joint income of a couple. So when we talk about family, we usually mean spouses, one for another, de facto or married, straight or gay, and that's a real issue with an unemployment payment like that, because of course it's individuals who work and have jobs, but the income testing has been on the couple unit, so many
Louise
are not eligible.
Louise could be a casual in retail with regular shifts, but with a partner who still has a permanent full-time job and thus would not be eligible for job keeper because she's not been with the employer for more than 12 months, or job seeker because of the...
Depending on that household income.
Family arrangements.
That's right. And it goes to our kind of anxiety in this country about what we think of as middle-class welfare. That's possibly something you've talked about with your listeners over the years. And I think we need to stop being so concerned about delivering income support to households where there is someone in work. If we have someone who's actually lost a job, that individual's potentially should be eligible.
And that brings us to universal basic income, which I promised we would get to. Jill's question is precisely on point. Isn't it time to review all concepts of, in inverted commas, welfare and the expensive systems we use to hand it out and go to a universal basic income? So first of all, explain what is universal basic income, how does it work, and what would it require in Australia if we were to transition to it?
So sometimes called a guaranteed minimum income or even a negative, we have a negative income tax, that is a payment instead of paying tax. The assumptions are, the basic assumptions are that it would be universal, as in, for example, all working age adults or and retirees, and it would be a certain minimum level, adequate level, which we think probably would have to be higher than New Start was before because that wasn't adequate. So making that everyone would be eligible for that payment. In fact, we would sort of pay it to everyone, but then we would also...
Even if you've got a job?
Yeah, so then what we would do is we would tax your earnings, potentially from the first dollar. So, for example, no tax-free threshold, and just tax your earnings.
Because at the moment you don't pay tax up to 15...
It's about 18,200, and even a little higher if you've got a low wage.
Yep.
And then you have a progressive rate structure, 19%, 32%, 45%. So... The upside of that is that everyone's eligible. The Henderson Inquiry in 1975 in Australia, the Poverty Inquiry, actually advocated something like this. And what they said was receiving an income support or paying taxes are two sides of the same coin. So there's that idea that everyone's potentially eligible, but everyone also potentially pays taxes, right? And that's fair. It is, as a matter of fiscal cost, as in the budget type cost, a lot more than our highly targeted income system that we have at the moment. And so we would have to decide that we might need to pay some more taxes.
So what's the advantage? Is it just that it destigmatises the concept of being on welfare?
I think it would destigmatise in the sense that everyone is eligible. That's one consequence. The other, I think, big advantage of moving in that direction is that it manages risk. And I think the reason why we're suddenly talking about this again, even though politically I think it's still very unlikely, is that COVID-19 shows us that these risks can come at us. And the bushfires, entire towns shut down for extended periods of time, no jobs available, nothing to support those people. That it operates as a social insurance and a social insurance.
So it's a genuine safety net.
A safety net for the middle class as well as for the poorest.
Because one of the other things we've learned is that, for instance, if people are casuals in a pandemic and therefore they're not eligible for sick pay, John, one of the things is that then means they are, there's no financial incentive for being absent from work. In fact, you're penalised. So you go to work when you think you might be sick and then you spread the germs.
Which, I think was something that was happening with the Cedar Meats case in Victoria. So
the abattoir, where people didn't want to miss a shift because they can't afford to, because there's no sick pay. So if you have a universal basic income, you're helping meet that need as well.
Yep. Yeah, no, I think that's right. Meeting that need, managing those risks, as Miranda said. And I think sort of underpinning a lot of changes people go through across the life course between being in work, paying tax, periods of re-education or education, periods of retirement or illness.
Periods of caring.
Yep. Disability, all of those things. We've covered a lot of ground from the gig economy and reforming awards and best off overall test and so many other things. Thank you both very, very much. Professors John Howe and Miranda Stewart from the University of Melbourne, from the Melbourne Law School, as part of the second panel on Germs and Justice. And our third panel will be looking at internal borders and governance issues for Germs and Justice number 3. Just in the last few days, we've seen COAG, the Council of Australian Government, being put to bed. COAG is dead, but long live the National Cabinet, where premiers are more powerful now than some government federal ministers. So that'll be next week. I hope you've enjoyed Germs and Justice on ABC Radio National Big Ideas and Facebook Live. And thank you for joining us.